So next up, we are going to start discussing about the diversity plan, which is also another, really critical piece of this application, which is Exhibit M. And our next guest speaker is actually Tiffany Bowden. So Tiffany Bowden is the co-founder of the Minority Cannabis Business Association. She has all these education materials that she presents related to diversity plans. And, we will be focused and deep diving on this a little bit more. Obviously, diversity is a very important part of this. It's interesting, for me in my 25-year career being in cannabis, I've seen this progress, in terms of diversity and social equity, all across the country, as it started, primarily here in Oakland, California, where our headquarters are. We were able to, kind of create and help foster one of the first social equity programs out there. And I think that, it's really interesting to see this go across the country. And so we're going to bring Tiffany Bowden in on to discuss that a little bit more. So how you doing, Tiffany?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Good. Thank you for coming online with us too. And, we really appreciate you having you too as well. So, we want to always foster a culture of safety, when it comes down to operating these types of businesses. And that's something that's very important to us, including diversity inclusion. So, we would love to hear, your thoughts on, the Illinois process, specifically Exhibit M, and, any other thing that you can provide in terms of that type of education or resource behind that. So I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, sure. I thought it might be helpful just in general to just kind of provide some background into myself, as well as why this work is important and why it's important to legislators. And so then you'll be able to kind of back into what's so important about that section, as well as the whole application. I think that when we kind of talk about diversity as a particular section, it does a little bit of a disservice from a standpoint that inclusion and diversity should be running throughout the presentation. And of course, the people that are grading these applications, when they're calling these things out, these are works of passion that they've been having for multiple years. So these are things that they want to ultimately be able to see throughout. So is it okay if I kind of provide some context? Okay, great. All right. Well, let's just see here. I don't know how to, share my screen. What's the best way to do the share screen? Okay. Let's see. Okay, here we go. Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I'm Tiffany Bowden. I'm with the Otesha Consulting, and I'm going to just let you guys know a little bit about me in context. As you mentioned, I'm the co-founder of the Minority Cannabis Business Association. I'm also the former VP of Education for the National Diversity and Inclusion for Cannabis Alliance. I'm the runner-up for the Social Equity Program Manager position in Los Angeles, and I am a PhD candidate for University of Illinois within this specialization area. So I've taught several cannabis-based classes in the university circuit in Illinois, and I've also helped shape zoning in Illinois. So I've been in that space ultimately since about 2009. There's several other things that you can kind of read about me, and I'll send out the presentation here later. But I think it's important to kind of have a base level discussion on what is the difference between diversity and inclusion and equity, because then you'll be able to kind of understand what's going on here. So diversity, when we're talking about it, is generally about an appreciation of difference across categories, and the goal is ultimately to strive for equality. Whereas inclusion is about the act or practice of including a particular group into an activity, which is, of course, a build on diversity, but it's a step better. Equity, however, is about the fair treatment, access and opportunity and advancement for all people, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. So within the cannabis space, it's important to understand that what we're actually talking about is equity. And a lot of times what happens is that when I see dispensary applications, cultivation applications come through, they kind of keenly understand the need for diversity. And so they'll speak to a diversity and in terms of their demographics of their ownership and maybe some of their staff. But they won't be able to get into intuitively the things around inclusion and equity. And those are the things that are actually more important to the people who are grading the application. And so if your diversity plan is, we have X amount of minorities, X amount of women, X amount of veterans, then you're actually kind of behind the eight ball. And we have to, we have to kind of, we need,
yeah.
we need an actual plan.
I mean, it's like the how, right? Like where's the how? Like, of course you can be diverse, but how are you going to do it? So I totally get that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. So like for me, so when you think about like the social equity aspects, right? So you have to understand that it's all about the impact that the war on drugs has had on specific communities. So that's where this conversation is actually taking place. And so then therefore they're looking for programs and operators who can speak this language and can practice restorative justice, but through a business lens. It's perfectly understood that you may not actually know how to do that, and that's why you bring people to the table that know how to speak that language. But some of the areas to consider looking would be like your community impact story. So, you know, how is your tax revenue going to provide uplift? Like, what are you paying your employees? Is that above or below or at minimum wage? And what is the impact of that? Where is your location source? What is your procurement practices? Your marketing and advertising practices, what does that look like? Your staffing, your ownership, what kind of ongoing employee support and benefits do you have? You know, all kinds of things ultimately can go into your plan above and beyond what they're specifically asking you for. And ultimately, the more successful applications that I've seen are speaking to these kinds of things beyond just say like the diversity space. So some of the things that's kind of been in the headlines already, inclusive of Illinois, is that there's a lot of concern about minorities being shut out of ownership. So of course, at that first level of diversity, they're going to be looking for what is the makeup of your team. And that doesn't necessarily mean that, okay, we're just like, we're counting bodies. They, of course, they want to make sure that you have a strong and qualified and competent team. But at the same time, they're going to be looking into making sure that it's not just tokenism and window dressing and that you're just putting people kind of on the front lines. And also that you can actually carry that diversity story throughout the application. We've also seen some issues with retention in the industry for both women and minorities. So there's going to be a need for some language within the application as it relates to how you're going to be supporting people ongoing. We've also seen the increase of homelessness in areas where operators have been moving because of like the cost of living increases and impacts. So depending on who your local legislators are, sometimes they kind of have an interest in this, but they may not spell these kinds of things out in the application. There's a lot of things that are not on the application that you would have to kind of know who's behind the scenes to know what they actually care about to be able to speak to those things. And you can also speak to those within your goodwill and your social responsibility statement. Your marketing and advertising is also important, and we already understand that as it relates to how it interfaces with children. That's kind of grabbed headlines a lot, but there's rarely like a conversation about women and minorities and how those things are kind of positioned there. And depending on kind of how that's interfacing, that does take a space as well. And of course, sexual harassment training is another thing that's been on the horizon in terms of what people are ultimately wanting to see, whether or not that's actually detailed as a mandatory for the state or not. It's one of those things that it gives a cue that you're actually trying to do the right thing. So these are just some of the top headlines. So you can think about diversity as being embedded into your seed to sale kind of process. Like most people are thinking about it only within like the post-processing space in terms of who is actually going to be the actors involved. But actually diversity is embedded all throughout these processes, and it's something that that we can kind of take on So there's lots of different ways ultimately that I can help in you guys, and that's specifically consulting at the intersection of diversity in cannabis, as well as just like working alongside, your team, as well as making sure that there's a compliance and a culture change approach, because both of those elements are important for legislators. It's not just about checking boxes and just like, okay, yes, we have this, yes, we have that, but they ultimately want to be able to make sure that you can actually carry forward the culture and the intention of what these social equity initiatives are about. So that's kind of high level. Just wanted to get you guys grounded in the conversation that we're having here in this space, and we can maybe ask some questions from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. This is fantastic. I think I'm aware of like some kind of education modules that you have or training systems or something like that around this.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah, my wife Sarah was telling me a little bit about that. Is that something that you provide?
Yeah, definitely. So formerly, I was the owner of Comfy Tree Cannabis Academy and Comfy Tree Enterprises, which is an education company. I have left that company behind, and now I do ad hoc creations for applicants. So nearly 100% of my time is built around supporting people like you guys. So
Awesome.
that is, for sexual harassment training, or if it's doing on-site diversity training. For instance, last week I just did Movember Foundation's diversity training. I don't know if you're familiar with No Shave November. They're the people who put that forward. So I just assisted with them, as well as Kikoko, which is a cannabis tea company. Yes, I've done their diversity training as well.
Nice.
But yeah, I do modules and I do on-sites as well.
Nice. And then, I wonder if you're aware of or have more information on this too, but we get a lot of questions around, the loans and grants that the state of Illinois is offering, or specifically around the social equity program. We get like different levels of questions around that. But one of the questions is when the applications will become available to apply for any of those loans or grants, is that coming around this time in this dispensary round, or is it going to be waiting for craft grow?
Well, it's kind of one of those things where the government, well, specifically Illinois, has been one of those shell games. It's since it's always been a shell game. Since I started engaging in 2009. So it's kind of one of those things where, yes, okay, pay attention to what they're saying, but have a backup plan.
Totally.
Do not rely on the state of Illinois as a part of your business model if you can help it.
I mean, I remember how tough it was in 2014 because we opened up the first dispensary in the state, and it was in Marion, Illinois, and very difficult process. And it was really, really interesting to go that. So you definitely heed that advice for sure. But again, it's really awesome to see a state, come out and really recognize that, hey, we really need to create some kind of, a place to make this happen. Like they're taking it definitely a step further than any state that I've seen, in terms of that, at least, making a step forward in terms of this financial assistance, right? And I think that financial assistance is going to be really important. That training, all these different aspects are going to be very important, as well as any type of reentry programs for folks that have been, to prison by the war on drugs, and really helping these folks get back into a normal life, so it's really interesting to see that. But again, that's a lot of questions we get, around that, because a lot of these folks do need, the financial assistance to go through this process. It's very expensive to a certain degree. And, we've been just supporting this process as much as we can with our application accelerator, as well as, some of these things that we're doing here with you today. And, I think it's really, really important. So I was wondering if you had any other further information around that, needed, if you're getting any information. It's important to collaborate too, as well as all the information we're getting.
Yeah. Well, so just in terms of some of the things that you mentioned with reentry and all of those things are really important. I do partner with organizations that focus on those types of efforts. Mm-hmm. So for instance, expungement programs, people don't understand how important it is to be able to simply remove felonies from your record, just so that people can work in various operations, not even just cannabis operations, but to just be able to remove that stain from their life. Because ultimately, if you have these felonies, you're not even able to get federal student loans. You can't live in federal housing. Like, there's so many different impacts that these felonies have on people's lives. So one of the groups that I work with helps to kind of remove those barriers and just to help improve quality of life just in general. Another program that I help empower is mental health for people of color within these areas. So that can, work for removing some of the trauma impacts from the war on drugs, as well as just the general community. So there's a few different things that I think that are really important that go kind of beyond what's generally spoken of, and things that people generally are not really thinking of that are deeply impacting. But yes, the state has come a long way since its pilot program, and it's very, very scary journey.
It's always scary. It's always scary.
It was very scary. Hats off to you for going through that.
Right. So we got a question from one of the audience. So the IDFPR only has 5 points for the diversity statement, but do you think there's a large implicit grade in the rest of the sections?
Yes, I do. So that's kind of what I'm meaning by, okay, yes, there's only a call out, a specific call out there for these 5 diversity points. But as I mentioned, diversity is a seed to sale kind of a deal. And you want to be able to tell a coherent story throughout, because the heart and spirit of everything should be able to carry kind of throughout, but they're going to be only asking very specific questions within that section. So every state is different in terms of how they present that diversity matters to them. But if it shows up at all on the application, and understand that when these people go behind closed doors and they're talking, then this is something that they care about. It's just a matter of how does it present itself.
Absolutely, 100%. And just like you said, it needs to be woven into the DNA of the entire, brand, to the entire business. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. But from a scoring perspective, I mean, like, everything needs to be like kind of sprinkled throughout, even though they're asking for specific questions in each one of these sections. So that's a good answer for that, for sure.
Yeah, and I would just I'll mention, for as an example, like, so I've been on some application teams where they only had a call out for diversity, like within a couple questions, but because I was able to look at their full application, was able to kind of tie it together coherently and look at some of their packaging things and say, okay, this is actually not going to work as it relates to inclusion and diversity. And so then we're able to give a stronger communication as it relates to their business plan and why they're choosing what they're choosing. And so you can see a different level of intention and social responsibility that's kind of woven through the business plan that speaks a lot louder than just simply saying, this is what we're going to do, this is how much money we're going to make, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think that there's maybe some folks out there that may not qualify as social equity, but still may be impacted by the war on drugs. And, I think just, with those types of folks, it seems like there's another area there where they're able to focus a lot on, how do they bring in, more social equity, qualified social equity folks into their workforce, right? Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how do we assemble like that type of workforce and help folks in that area?
Yeah, so in terms of like the recruitment and diversity efforts, that is a fairly extensive process just in itself, because when we're thinking about that, I mean, those efforts can just depend on like, all right, are you going after people of color? Are you going after veterans? Are you going after people who are alternatively abled? So the nuance in terms of the inclusion and recruitment conversations can be pretty detailed. But just specifically in dealing with, as an example, African Americans, not everybody has had a conviction of cannabis on their record or something, and therefore directly impacted by the war on drugs in the way that we generally talk about it. However, these are communal issues, and taken more broadly, you're able to see lift to the whole community by being able to focus on the whole. So it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to make, pipelining people with convictions into operation per se, if that's not the angle that you were taking. Like even, for instance, working with historically Black universities, setting up internship programs, making sure that the community is involved with your efforts, having recruitment events in areas where, you know, diverse people can actually see the job posting and what you're up to, and going beyond, say, bias processes of recruitment and pipelining.
Right.
These are all like really important ways that you can kind of practice inclusive practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just important all around. I mean, just to be able to provide that economic opportunity, just for everybody, all the above, as much as possible, if you are able, and if you're willing, right? You know, I think that that's a really critical thing, and it's great to be a part of an industry that's pushing that paradigm shift, you know, and helping us, because we haven't really seen that anywhere else. Everywhere else, every other industry is just rampant with this, kind of terrible mindset around this. But for us, we're really trying to push this, and we're starting to see it kind of slowly take hold in other places. But I think it's fabulous to do this now in this time frame, and we really appreciate all the work that you do.
Yeah,
you're doing a lot of great work out there.
Thank you.
It's really awesome to see this. So we would like to field any more questions. If there's any questions around these plans, or for Tiffany herself, and we want to see if you could put it into the chat box. That would be helpful. So one of the questions that just came up is: do you have suggested organizations or networks that Black women or women of color who are trying to get into the Illinois cannabis business should join for support and resources?
Yeah, there's a long list of people who've been doing things, but as I mentioned, the industry is fairly volatile in a sense of, you'll have organizations that'll be on the move and they're doing things, and then what happens is that we will see a hemorrhaging of either people or organizations because of different things like misogyny and, just impacts that we're seeing. So there's some really, really great and profound players and organizations that's been in the space and then have had to leave the space, and then they're coming back. And those people there are some of those folks that I would say that you could throw some support around, and even include them on your board of directors. They may not be like noisy in the space in terms of having their organizations already uplifted. That will still be really, really great to put on the organization. But one thing that I will kind of caution is whenever you are aligning with any organization, you have to be very privy to the politics that that's going on behind there. So I try to kind of avoid.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I actually kind of give the warning of a proceed with caution whenever aligning with any organization. In any kind of like a full-on committed kind of a way, rather than just like making yourself open and available to all organizations as an active ally in the space. You should definitely do your research to make sure that the organizations that you are aligning with are truly a stand for the people, because we do have a lot of organizations that are diverse and are picking up the mantra of diversity, but they're not actually inclusive. They might be directly ableist or misogynist, or there's like some very, very strange histories behind there.
I mean, it's a sad thing, but it's very true, because you know what? I mean, a lot of social equity folks that I've talked to just throughout the United States and going through these processes specifically, is they're vulnerable. Right? They become a target to investors that do have these, bad practices, or groups that do have these bad practices. And if they don't do enough due diligence, enough education around these groups, or even just like a straight feeling, do we align in values? Do we have the same mission? These are all important questions you need to ask yourself before you decide to align with the group, or even have an investor come up and work with you. I've seen that too many times, and it's just, it's really sad. We need to do more to educate, protect people from these kinds of things, because it's happening all over the place.
All over. And that's actually the most important question is like, does an organization or an entrepreneur or an investor share your why? That's actually the most important thing, regardless of any other factor. And so unfortunately, what you'll see though is people are like, oh, I need to find a Black person to put in this role, or I need to find a such and such to
terrible. It's like ridiculous. I mean, I can't believe people even think like that. I mean, there's nothing, just or fair or even right about any of that. No. And I think that, we're seeing a lot happen a lot, and it's really not cool at all.
Yeah.
And I think that really the way we found our company through the haze and noise of the industry in the early days was by coming up with our values.
Yes,
right? Because as soon as
that's
you come up with
important.
your values, it could be 2 words, it could be 1 word, it could be 3 words, it could be 5 words. Don't go past 5 usually, but I think that if you come up with those values, it's actually your navigational compass on the relationships you want to develop. And
Yes.
these relationships start coming to you by almost like a mantra of practicing it. I mean, have you experienced
Yes.
the same thing? Or
Oh gosh, yes. Oh gosh, yes. And the most important thing that you can possibly learn in this whole business is who to say no to.
right.
There's a lot of opportunity in this space, okay? There's not a dearth of opportunity or people or great ideas, but honestly, the more that you can kind of hone in on your why and your values, that's going to really take you a lot further. And there's going to be a diverse amount of people that do share that, and that's where you should pull your inclusion efforts from. It should not be like a cut and paste, like let's just throw people into position because they look a certain way or because of whatever. When that happens, you get an unstable organization because you don't really have any unity whatsoever. It just becomes really messy, actually, under the hood.
Right. I mean, even though, like, for example, like veterans, for instance, like, veterans, they have they're very strong about their mission. They want to support, their fellow brothers and sisters that, help, experience the same thing that they went through. So I feel like they really know how to like get it like dialed in terms of unity. I feel like, a lot of other folks out there, they're struggling with some of this, and coming up with that mission statement, which kind of unifies everything, as you said earlier, or coming up with their values. So again, I think that's very important to have that, and that's where I would say it's like your North Star of your business, right? And your marketing material could come out of that, your mission statement could come out of that, and then just your ongoing practices as you go forward, and how you treat your community, everything involved with that. So it's very, very important.
Yeah.
There's another question we just got. Do you think the department will see through commercial groups that are exploiting or tokenizing social equity applicants?
I will say that they're getting better at it. I know that, like, within the work that I have been doing in Los Angeles, they have specific meetings behind the scenes to vet out and weed out these kinds of window washing type of practices. And so just because of like my work that I've been doing behind the scenes with that, I also understand that this is something that it carries from state to state. And so everything that is going into this process is not on the website, and that's for sure. So the things that happen off of the website, are the conversations about what's really going on. So they absolutely are going to be plugged in with some of what we call shenanigans that happens. And to the extent that they can do something about it, that's always evolving. And that may come out as later iterations as they do different investigations. So it's just really a good idea to just start correctly.
Yeah.
So just start correctly and start with integrity so that you don't have to, deal with all of the shell game stuff.
Yeah. I mean, there's always so many, I guess there's only so many, I mean, every state process I've been in, and I've been in a lot of them, but every state process, I've seen it progress a little bit with different mechanisms in terms of how they're trying to, eliminate that. I don't think they'll fully eliminate it, obviously, but, I think that'll be, pretty much impossible, but at least they're trying to make an effort to try to, how do we get it to the point where they, these folks are just totally vulnerable, and exploited, such as this last question that we just had, and I do think, obviously, in every process, there's always shenanigans happening behind closed doors.
Yeah. Well, there's and then there's a conversion between the activists and the entrepreneurs. So as more of the people who are in the activist space kind of move on to the business side, you're going to be seeing just different ways of doing things. And as more of the entrepreneurs get more privy to some of the things that the activists are talking about, you start to see influence on that side as well. So things are moving in the direction that they need to be. We're not in any kind of perfect place. We may never get to an absolute utopia, but but we're moving.
No, well, I really appreciate you, taking your time, and I'm sure our viewers do too as well. And all the great work that you're doing, it's fantastic. And I think that it's important to recognize this as definitely one of the most important pieces of what we're fighting for. We're fighting for freedom at the end of the day. All of us are, right? When cannabis, first, started with, it really, back in 1996, when Proposition 215 came out, it was like, really, how do we fight for our freedom, to be able to use this plant as a medicine, and as something that's going to help us move further. So that's fantastic. And again, I really appreciate you coming online. So I think that's the end of our webinar series. And, again, we're going to send out everybody's information. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next time.